That's it.
Working. Okay, look at me. Okay, so let me present. Hold on. Yeah, there we go. Did it work? Yes. Okay.
You say you're not tech savvy, but you're on Canva, for goodness sake. That's impressive.
I'm trying new things. I'm trying to diversify, go away from Google Slides. So I'm trying. But thank you. So my presentation is called Seeking Liberation, Facing Marginalization, AAPI Conditional Acceptance in Hip Hop Culture. So first, I wanted to start with a little hip hop history. I'm sure most of you know a little bit about hip hop. It's so mainstreamed right now, but it has Afro-Caribbean, Black, and Latinx origins. So we see hip hop comes from a tradition of, let's say, for Jamaican culture, we see toasting. So it's the idea of kind of an early form of rapping where it's like you're at a party, the MC comes on, and they're kind of toasting to the crowd. We also have traditions, African traditions, where there's kind of these like griot culture where we're telling stories, we're all gathering together and listening to a story, this oral tradition of rooted in African and Black culture. And we see the pioneers of hip hop. A lot of them actually came out of the Caribbean. So we see people like Grandmaster Flash, DJ Kool Herc. They all came actually from Caribbean heritage themselves. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the four main pillars that comprise the main elements of hip hop. So emceeing, as you know, as rapping, it utilizes vocal rhyming ability. This is where MCs can really show their skills, their lyrical wordplay, things like that. And then as far as DJing goes, turntablism, you're really creating, you're using mixing equipment and turntables to make a new creation. So this is where you'd have sampling. So to think about sampling and its history, it totally makes sense. So we're using sampling because at this time, if you look in the 1970s, this is when hip hop was kind of coming out of New York City and then spreading across the country and through the world in the 80s. But in the 1970s, you look at what school life was like then, or the educational system in New York City. We see in the 1970s, arts programs are being severely cut all around in order to avoid a fiscal crisis. And so, of course, the arts go first. So we have all of these people who don't have instruments, they don't have access to them. So for them, turntablism and being able to use a turntable becomes their instrument. So it's interesting that that context, right, is what created hip hop kind of in a way. We also have breaking. So that's the movement component of hip hop. So you think of break dancing and popping and locking, and there's been so many movements. Now we have all these like viral dance movements going on. But this is really where it started, out of the breaking or breakdancing movement. Now, finally, we have graffiti art, which is the visual component of hip hop. So again, you've probably seen or heard of like style wars in New York City, where graffiti artists would tag subway trains, and just tagging became this whole thing. You have crews. So it was really like hip hop culture inspired that expression visually. So I just wanted to kind of emphasize the point that hip hop culture, right? It's not just emceeing, it's not just dancing. There's various aspects to hip hop. So why hip hop? Why am I so interested in studying this? It's one of the most prolific forms of youth culture since the late 1970s. So it's brought in a lot of producers, practitioners, participants around the world. And this includes the AAPI community as well. What really drew me to this work is that for me, being a hip hop fan, but also being a race scholar, looking at the unique position that Asian Americans had in the racial hierarchy really fascinated me. So, you know, for years and years and years, in America, we had this racial hierarchy that was Black or white, right? Those were the two options. So where do people who aren't Black and white fit into the hierarchy? So also, a draw for me was challenging the historical invisibility of AAPI people within popular media and society at large. So it's the idea that although Asian Americans, especially, you know, on the West Coast, there's a significant Asian American population, but we still see invisibility in many regards for Asian Americans, whether that be politics, their representation in TV and film, their representation in mainstream music. It's like a community that is present in numbers, but still invisible when we look at popular culture. So for me, that was, you know, a big draw to study this topic. So first, I wanted to break down some of the notions we have of the AAPI community and Blacks in popular culture. Again, this is kind of the work we're also doing with the Geena Davis Institute, right? So we see Black women portrayed as masculine, we see angry, we see violent, we see hypersexual. And these are only some of the stereotypes, but I would argue that these are some of the most prevalent stereotypes that we see for Black women. As far as Black men go, we see hypermasculine, promiscuous, criminal, and I included here the cool pose. So if you're not familiar with what the cool pose is, it's this posturing, it's this physical movements, okay? So people can kind of think of it as like a swag, right? So it's this physical posturing, but it was actually created to combat the effects of racism and oppression. And in the way, it's like, if I act cool, if I act super masculine, then I can be tough, right? I can, you know, kind of bring myself up in a way. And that's, I think, a big part of hip hop is this hypermasculinity. You know, that being said, hip hop isn't perfect, but I think what I'll show through the presentation is that it has a lot to offer. For AAPI men, we see stereotypes of emasculation, physically weak, nerdy, and all brain, no brawn. So it's this idea, if we look at gender or masculinity as a spectrum, we see that white hegemonic masculinity lies in the center. And then we have Asian American or AAPI men on one side, which is emasculated. And we have Black men on the other side who are hypermasculine, right? So they still, even AAPI men and Black men still fall outside of what we consider as normal masculinity. So I just want to have you keep that in mind. So we have AAPI women who are thought of as submissive, exotic, and cunning. So kind of devious in a way. We can see that's also diametrically opposed to what we see Black women being portrayed as. So again, both these groups are falling outside of the norm of what whiteness is and what we think is normal femininity, quote unquote, I say normal femininity, normal masculinity, right? But they're both at opposite poles. So all of these stereotypes that I've talked about play in to serve to reinforce racial hierarchy. And how do they do this? They do this by showing their difference from whiteness, right? So we have Blackness on one end, we have Asianness on another end, but they're still extreme from what we think of as mainstream femininity and masculinity. Although they're opposed, they're still both different than the norm. So first, I'm going to talk about the issues of acceptance for AAPI in hip hop. So what I found from my respondents, and just sorry, step back a little bit. My research is mainly qualitative. So I did open-ended interviews, which I taped and then transcribed and then coded for themes. So it was a long process, but it was very fruitful for me. Doing these interviews was great, and I got a lot of data. So what I found, some of the themes I found was people were trying to struggle to fit in. So they're in this limbo between Blackness and whiteness. So it's the idea that, okay, well, I don't really fit in with my white counterparts, but I actually also don't fit in with my Black counterparts. So where do I stand? So that was a big theme. Also, the narrow definition of masculinity for AAPI men, like what type of masculinity to embrace. So it's the idea of like, well, if I embrace, you know, hyper masculine persona of hip hop, I'm still, you know, embracing something that might be not so good. And the same thing for if I'm embracing, you know, hegemonic masculinity and whiteness, that's also something that is not necessarily appealing. So that's kind of another question that came up. And then AAPI women, also we saw that they may be preferred for background and voiceless roles. So there's this real struggle to be heard. So it's the idea that, yes, maybe they might be cast as like a quote unquote video chick or someone behind the scenes. So maybe a DJ who is like off in the corner, right, playing the music. But these main roles up in front in the foreground are missing. So that also says a lot. Although they're in the culture, they're also relegated to the margins. So that's also something that I found generally in my research with both AAPI women and men. Okay, so collaboration and unity is also a big theme that I found in my work. So hip hop has this long history of people who come together with their individual talents and they collaborate on something innovative and creative. So we see that like even now with mainstream hip hop, we see a lot of collaborations going on. Like you'll have a song with like 5, 6 artists, right? And even like mixing of genres. So now it's not just hip hop, it's hip hop and we see hip hop and country, we see hip hop and pop, we see hip hop and R&B. So it's not only collaborating within hip hop culture, but also taking from other genres of music, which I think is interesting. And this speaks to the whole idea of a crew. So a crew is just like the people you hang with, the people you collaborate and do art with. And it's a group of like-minded individuals coming together to cultivate this artistic expression. And I think that's what hip hop boils down to. It's an idea of how to express myself, especially for people who had been silenced for so long. So if we look at the roots of, you know, Black folks in this country, right? It's the idea like, okay, we're being oppressed on so many levels. Where can we channel this energy? Where do we have an outlet for all of this? And going back to the collaborations, it gives us a new way to see reality and really push boundaries. So I think also another key factor or key aspect of hip hop is pushing boundaries. So again, with the sampling, that was a huge innovation that really, you know, hadn't been done before. And then also we see continuing to seek sampling now, mixing of music. So really the potential is limitless of what you can create through the culture. So I included a quote here. Actually, one of the artists in the museum exhibit, Nisha Sethi, she is from Oakland. She's Southeast Asian and she's awesome. So she said that hip hop began as an expressive tool for communities of color. Now hip hop culture can be an avenue for one to express their connection to various identities that often lack prominence in society. Hip hop becomes a commonality that connects diverse groups. So we're seeing now, again, that idea of expression. And also you can connect to the identities that you have. Most of the folks in my exhibit talk about how they were able to express their AAPI identity through their work. And it was something that they were really proud of. So again, the idea that identity is important. And this may be an avenue of how people can share that with others. So locality and community also is a big one. I know this is a huge quote, but basically, I'll read it off. Place, space, and community are important aspects of hip hop culture. Beginning in cramped house parties in New York City, hip hop was incredibly accessible to anyone who wanted to join the hip hop community. Although the community aspect of hip hop has always been vital, people can still express their individuality while remaining a part of a collaborative. This provides a sense of belonging to a community of individuals and a common place where people can cultivate common interests and goals. So again, going back to the fact that maybe you feel you're living in the inner city of New York City, and you feel like you don't really have a place, this kind of became a safe haven for people. You felt like you could express yourself. You felt like you were around people who had common goals and ideas that you had. So this quote is actually from another person from my exhibit talking about Firecracker. That was this, I think it ran for 12 years in Chinatown, but it was a place where like that transcended age and gender and race. So the people who were coming out of there were, just this amalgamation of people. It was actually pretty cool. And we see like Aloe Black, Anderson .Paak, all just to name a few who like came through and joined in this space. And it was very special for people to enjoy. So one of my favorite themes is looking at hip hop as resistance and also its power to create social change. So hip hop emerged as an outlet for highlighting inequality in the inner city, like poverty, lack of employment, mistreatment by law enforcement, and lacking social services. Through advocating social change, hip hop has the potential to act as a movement to help reduce the hardship of communities of color. Hip hop can lend a voice to the voiceless in order to push social activism and equality in society. So I think this says a lot. If we're looking at it, in 1978 and then 2021, we see, hey, all of these things still very much apply, right? So it's the idea that in the early stages, it was really an arena where we started seeing people talk about these issues. And they were going on every day, but maybe people outside of the inner city had no idea or didn't care to know. Yeah, I think also the same themes run prevalent today. As we see, 2020 has been such, a monumental, unique year for all of us. And I think one of the biggest parts of it is the idea of social change, resistance, dissent. So hip hop, I think, fosters a lot of those ideals as well. All right, so lessons learned. What have we learned from this? So we've learned that hip hop is a space where racial stereotypes are less pronounced. However, we still see these gender and race boxes being created. So API community members might feel more accepted, but however, they're relegated to the margins. So there's still like narrow window for gender norms and racial norms. So although there is maybe more flexibility within hip hop, there are still norms that rule it, just as there are norms and stereotypes in society at large. So, however, hip hop can also be an opportunity to resist expectations. So although it is limiting, it is an idea, it is a place where we can resist expectations. So again, speaking back to social change, it might be an area where we can talk about those things, and someone doesn't have to be pigeonholed in, the stereotype of an Asian American man being like a computer geek, right? It's like in hip hop, I can be an MC, I can be a DJ, I can be a graffiti artist. So that's very different than what we see portrayed a lot of the times. It also counters the passive model minority stereotype. I'm sure many of you are familiar with that stereotype. So it's the idea that Asian Americans are the model minority, right? So if we're looking at Blacks, Latinx folks, Asian American and AAPI folks, they're the model minority, right? Because the stereotypes are Asian Americans are submissive, they're very smart, they're very hardworking. But again, I would argue, and a lot of the theory says, this was just a tool for racial division, right? So if Asian Americans are like, yes, we're the model minority, that's a higher status, yes, we'll hang on to that power, right? But what does it do for unity within, you know, racial groups? It divides, right? Because it's creating divisions that's saying this minority group is better than these other minority groups, right? And you see how that confirms white supremacy, white privilege, right? So one last slide. So hip hop music and hip hop culture can serve to undermine prejudice. I will acknowledge that hip hop, again, is not perfect. So it also can be, you know, obviously very sexist, very homophobic, transphobic. So I acknowledge all of these things. But I do also acknowledge that highlighting topics such as immigration, racism, participants can find a stronger voice. And also, hip hop culture can be an arena to explore the complexity of this American racial hierarchy. So we're not defining race through static or fixed categories, right? So we have racial hierarchy. I mean, I've read a lot on it during my studies. There's so many versions of it. But we know that nothing is fixed or static, just like gender, ability, you know, other axes of oppression. And to keep an intersectional lens, right? This whole class is about intersectionality, and it's the idea that we can't really focus on just race. We have to see how, you know, in this investigation, also how that plays with gender, with geography, with all these other things. So that's one thing I would say to keep in mind. I had one other special thing I wanted to show you. So I have this video that is Joe Baton. He was actually came out of East Harlem. He's Afro-Filipino, and he had the quote unquote first rap single. Now everyone thinks about Rapper's Delight. I'm sure you've heard it a million times in your life, I'm thinking. But he actually released his single weeks earlier. It just didn't get kind of the traction that Rapper's Delight did, but also he was 39 at the time when he released it. He had already a thriving career in like Afro Latin music. So I just want to show it to you, and it's very amusing, but this is Rapo Clapo. Here we go. Ooh. Just clap your hands, everybody. Everybody, come on, clap your hands. You can really rock, everybody. Everybody, come on, ring my bell. We got a new thing out, gonna make it sharp. Got rhythm, got beat, gonna move your feet. Got class, finesse, a whole lot of style. Gonna be around for a long, long while. Got something for the young, something for the old. Something that's missing from a rock and roll. Just clap your hands, everybody. Everybody, clap your hands. Just clap your hands, everybody. Everybody, clap your hands. It'll make you move, it'll make you go. Put a capital D on the word disco. Started in the States and jumped to Japan. Now it's known from land to land. It's known in Egypt, it's known in Rome. Known in Puerto Rico from home to home. Just clap your hands, everybody. Everybody, clap your hands. Just clap your hands, everybody. Everybody, clap your hands. You heard it in England, you heard it in France. The music's bound to make you dance. The music's good and it sounds terrific. Written in Chinese and hieroglyphics. It's got a new beat and I want you to know it's
Just clap your hands, everybody. Everybody, clap your hands. Just clap your hands, everybody. Everybody, clap your hands. Everybody, come on, clap your hands.
Okay, you get the point. But I thought it was fun because I didn't know about it until a couple years ago. I didn't even know this single existed. I think it's a great story. You know, he was not your typical like rap star that you would think of now, because rap stars are pretty young now. Like people start when they're like 17, 16, right? So yeah, just a little history, hip hop history, and Asian American hip hop history. So